Have you ever followed a crochet pattern and ended up with something that was either way too small or way too big? Well, the culprit is likely gauge, and I'm here to help you make sure that that does not happen on your next project. Hi everyone, Brittany here for Just Be Crafty. If you're new here, welcome, and if not, thank you so much for coming back. In today's video, we're going to talk all about gauge, what it is, how to measure it, and what to do if your gauge is off. So what is gauge? Gauge is essentially our tension, and all tension is how tight or how loose we crochet our stitches. Gauge is measured by how many stitches and how many rows fit inside of a certain measurement. That measurement is usually a 4" by 4" square or 10 by 10 centimeters. But the pattern will always tell you. A lot of times a gauge swatch will look something like this, or it could look something like a flat circle or just a granny square. It depends. But a lot of times gauge is measured in a 4" by 4" square, like I said, or a 10 by 10 centimeter if it's measured flat. If you're working something in the round, like let's say you're making a granny square, it wouldn't be how many stitches and rows, it would be how many granny rounds fit into certain inches. So it would maybe say 5 granny rounds equals 5 inches or something like that. Or for something like amigurumi or like these little baskets, something that is more of a 3D shape, it'll be measured in just like a flat circle. So for instance, this little basket here, it starts out with a flat circle. So for this pattern that is on my blog, it's measured by how many rounds, how many rounds fit into a certain measurement. So it's not always a 4" measurement. It depends. And like I said, the pattern will tell you. Everyone crochets a little bit differently. Some of us crochet a little bit tighter. Some of us crochet a little bit looser. And that's normal. But that's why gauge is so important. Let me show you something that completely opened up my eyes to gauge. And I really hope it'll help you visualize this too. So let's take a look at these two little crochet baskets. Both of these baskets followed the same exact pattern in the same exact yarn, just different colors obviously. But look how different they look. I crocheted them with 2 different size crochet hooks, but we'll get into that later. Both of these baskets have the same amount of stitches and rounds. They are made identically. So this little basket followed the pattern to a T, and as you can see, it looks nice and rigid. It's exactly how it's supposed to look, or how you would imagine a basket looks. I used a 4.5mm hook for this little basket. When I measured the bottom, it measured to 1.75 inches. So that's 1 3/4 inch. Now this basket right here, I veered off from the pattern a little bit. I used a 5.5mm hook. I followed the rest of the pattern exactly. And this same bottom has 4 rounds of single crochet, and the gauge for this one, those 4 rounds of single crochet equaled 2.5 inches. Between these 2 little baskets that follow the same pattern, it has a 3/4 inch difference between the two. So this could totally happen between 2 crocheters making the same pattern. So just in these 2 baskets alone, a 1mm bigger hook yielded this much floppier and flimsier and just not polished looking basket that's, 3/4 inch bigger. And these are very, very small. So imagine this multiplied over something like a larger project like a sweater or some other wearable, or honestly, even a blanket. Figure this one ate more yarn than this one too. So not only did it affect the size of the basket, it also affected how much yarn I used. So this is just kind of a little example so you can kind of see how gauge can be so important. I'm going to show you these 2 little swatches too, to just kind of give you a little comparison. So these 2 little swatches, obviously these are crocheted at different tensions and they have different gauges, right? So this yarn is a medium weight yarn, and I don't remember, I probably used a 5.5mm crochet hook for this, but I do know that this is 20 stitches wide. This one is a fine yarn. It's a fingering weight sock weight yarn. This one used a 3.5mm crochet hook, and this one is 17 stitches wide. So look at the difference between the two. So this is 17 stitches wide at this tiny little gauge, and at this much larger gauge, this is 20 stitches wide. So that's just to show you you that something that has similar stitch counts, depending on the size yarn, depending on your gauge, depending on the crochet hook you're using, it's going to yield different results. And as you can see, these are quite different results. Let's scale this example up to something like a sweater. So let's say we found this really cute sweater, crochet sweater pattern that we want to follow, and we are ready to do it. We want to do it right. So we're going to check our gauge. And looking at the pattern, let's say the pattern says that 16 stitches is equal to 4 inches. And for this example, we're going to ignore row gauge. This is kind of a discussion for another day, but depending on the project, row gauge may not be quite as important as stitch count. So for this sweater, let's say that row gauge doesn't really matter so much. Like it'll tell us to just crochet for a certain amount of stitches for the length instead of telling us to crochet a certain amount of rows. Because a lot of sweaters, when you crochet, unless you're making something like a yoke sweater, or if there's like some sort of like color pattern or stitch pattern that goes over multiple rows and something like that, the row gauge is going to be more important. But if we're just doing a standard, crochet stitch sweater, it's either top down or bottom up. The pattern just says like, it's this amount of stitches around or wide. You're just going to crochet up and down a certain amount of inches. So let's just say the pattern is like that for this example. Let's say the gauge is 16 stitches is equal to 4 inches. We grab our yarn, we grab our crochet hook, and we make our gauge swatch. Let's say we measure our gauge, which we will walk through an example of how to measure our gauge a little bit later, but just stay with me now. So let's say we get 18 stitches is equal to 4 inches. Our gauge is off a little bit. Doesn't sound like it's much, but what does that actually mean? So if you're getting more stitches per 4 inches than what the pattern says, our tension is just a little bit tighter than that of the designers. If we look at the designer's gauge, that's 16 stitches per 4 inches. If we divide 16 by 4, we get 4 stitches per 1 inch. So what about 18 stitches per 4 inches? In that number, if you divide, we get 4.5 stitches per inch. So that doesn't sound like a lot, right? So only 4 stitches per inch for the pattern, what the pattern calls for, and we're just getting 4.5 stitches per inch. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but trust me, in the end it is. So for the size of the sweater, let's say we picked the size that had a 40-inch finished bust. That would mean, if you do some quick math, that would mean if we were at the original gauge of 16 stitches is equal to 4 inches, that would mean that there's probably roughly about 160 stitches in the round for the bust, or it would be half of that if we were making it flat. But let's say it's in the round and the bust, to get the size that we want, it'll be about 160 stitches in the round. But with our tighter gauge at 18 stitches per 4 inches, that would mean that so let's say we crocheted and we made our sweater. It was 160 stitches around. We followed the pattern exactly. But because we crocheted tighter, that 160 stitches will have shrinked down to about a 35.5-inch bust. So that is 4 inches smaller than what we were intending our sweater to be. So we thought that our sweater was going to be 40 inches around, and when we finished, because our gauge was just 2 stitches tighter per 4 inches, it shrunk over 4 inches. That's quite a bit. So that's why it's so important to make sure that you do check your gauge and make sure it matches that of the designer, because even just being off just a tiny bit, it adds up over the course of the large sweater. Just think every 4 inches of the pattern, you're squeezing in more stitches per those 4 inches than that of the original design. I hope that made sense, but it's really eye-opening for me to sit down and actually do that math, because it is crazy that just being off 2 stitches in your 4-inch gauge could equate to over 4 inches shrunk in your finished bust measurement for a sweater. If you went in the opposite direction, that sweater could have possibly grown by over 4 inches around. So it's just really important to take into consideration gauge. So when I hear that people are jumping into patterns and not checking their gauge, or, sometimes like I get nasty comments about, I think, what was it? For my slouchy velvet knitted sweater, because in knitting it's really essentially the same thing. It's just knitted stitches versus crochet stitches. But I think, an example, someone made my twisted ear warmer pattern. No, it was my It was the Crochet Chunky hat. They gave me a bad review on Etsy and they left a comment saying that the hat pattern does not have accurate sizing and that she made the extra large and it came out the size of a toddler. I was like, oh no, she probably didn't check her gauge. And so we chatted, I reached out to her and she was like, oh yes. So if you're new to crochet, you might not even have thought about how we crochet at different tensions and how that can affect finished measurements of our finished projects. So it's just something to really make sure that we keep in mind. We understand why gauge matters, so let's walk through how to make a gauge swatch together. Here's what you'll need. You'll need your yarn, the recommended crochet hook listed in the pattern, plus 1 hook size up and 1 hook size down, just in case you need to adjust, scissors, and some sort of straight edge measuring tool. I love the Susan Bates Knit Check. It's compact, easy to use, and small enough to toss in your crochet tools pouch or project bag. I love this thing. I have 2 of them, and I'll be sure to have it linked in the description box below. Let's say the pattern tells us the gauge is about 12 half double crochet stitches over 11 rows is equal to 4 inches. So to make an accurate swatch, we need to make it a little bit bigger than that because we don't want to measure right at the edge where the tension can be a little off. I'm going to start with a foundation chain of 22. That gives me a few extra stitches on each side of the 12 that I'll be measuring. Starting in the 3rd chain from the hook, I'm going to half double crochet across the row. Okay, I've reached the end of the row. Now I'm going to chain 2 and turn my work and keep half double crocheting across. I'm going to keep repeating this for about 15 rows just to make sure I have more than the 11 rows listed in the pattern's gauge. Again, we want some extra fabric around the edges so we can measure from the center and get the most accurate reading. Once your swatch is done, weave in the ends and block it if the pattern says to. In this case, let's pretend it does, so I've given mine a gentle steam block to help it relax and settle into its true shape. Now that we have our swatch, it's time to learn how to measure our gauge. Let's walk through how to measure your crochet gauge. First, we want to take a close look at the top of our swatch. Usually this gives us the clearest view of our stitches. When we measure, we're counting the full stitches from side to side and from top to bottom. It's really important that we're not just eyeballing or measuring part of a stitch. Let's start by measuring stitch gauge. That's how many stitches fit across 4 inches. Using my gauge checker, again, I love the Susan Bates Knit Check, and I'll line it up with a row in the center of my swatch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Great, so that matches the pattern, so we've hit our stitch gauge. Now, let's measure row gauge, which can be a little trickier, but I'll show you a little trick. Each row of stitches stacks on top of the last, and it can be kind of hard to see where one starts and one ends. So here's what I like to do. Start your ruler or gauge checker at the very top of a row near the center of the swatch. Then just count the bottoms of each stitch as you move downward. Each one marks the end of a row. This way you're counting full rows from top to bottom and not getting lost in the middle of the fabric. And yay! I got row gauge too. So what if we didn't? If your swatch has more stitches or rows than the pattern, then that means that your tension is tighter than that of the designers. You might think, should I just crochet a little bit looser? But that's really hard to do consistently, so I'm going to say no. Instead, we're going to go up 1 hook size to loosen up our stitches and make another swatch. Keep repeating that until your gauge matches the pattern. If your swatch has fewer stitches or rows than the pattern, then that means that your tension is looser than the designers. In this case, try going down a hook size to tighten things up and make a new swatch. The most important thing to remember is you're not trying to change the way you crochet, you're just adjusting your tools to help match the pattern's gauge. And once you hit it, your project is so much more likely to fit just right. Let's talk about blocking and fiber behavior. In a lot of patterns, it will not only give you the gauge instructions, but it'll also tell you if your gauge swatch, like this, should actually be blocked. All blocking is really just giving your crochet item a bath. So whether that might be soaking in a little bit of mild detergent and then laying flat to shape to dry, or for acrylic items, I like to use a steamer and then I like to pin it to shape and then run a steamer over it. And what blocking does is it really helps relax the fibers and help them kind of move into where they're supposed to be. But it's really important that if they're telling you to block your swatch, then that means you need to wait to measure your gauge until after you actually blocked your swatch. Different fibers behave differently after blocking. So let's talk about acrylic yarn first, which is what I highly recommend for beginners. Acrylic yarn, if you block it with like a bath, it's really not going to change too much. It's going to change the most with steaming, applying a little bit of heat to it. The fibers, just when you wet them, it just won't change too much. So with an acrylic thing, the gauge might not change too much. But if you are crocheting with a fiber like superwash merino wool, that one will grow significantly with blocking. So if a pattern is giving you a certain gauge and it's made with superwash merino wool and it's telling you to get that certain measurement blocked, it's very important to do so, because basically whatever you're going to do to your finished project, so like a sweater, you're going to be washing it at the end, I'm sure. It's going to be worn. You really need to do whatever you're going to do to the swatch that you're going to do to the item when you're finished with it. And not only is it important to wash things, like I said, it really helps the stitches to relax and really gives your piece a more polished look once it's been blocked. So that's why it's super important to make sure you really follow the pattern's instructions when checking your gauge. And really the only way to know how a fiber is going to react is to just block it and check your gauge, because things like Surrey alpaca, and if you're using just like, different blends, or there's really no way to know unless you block it. And it's also important to make sure that you let your project completely dry and then measure the gauge. Then you can't just crochet your little swatch and then give it a little bath, lay it flat, and then measure the gauge. You have to wait until it fully dries. This is typically the reason why people do skip making a gauge swatch, because it does take so much time. But if we go back to the sweater example, and let's say we don't check our gauge, or we don't, adjust our needle size, we don't adjust our crochet hook size to make sure we do get the proper gauge, the amount of time it takes to make a sweater, which can be anywhere between 40 to 60, maybe 80 hours, depending on our speed of crocheting. It's a lot less time to make the swatch, block it, and then to check your gauge. But anyway, it's really important to check on the pattern and follow the instructions for the pattern for how you're supposed to measure your gauge. So even something, not even just the fiber really, something, stitch pattern can matter. So let's say you're making something that is ribbed, that can relax significantly after blocking, because when you're crocheting it, it could be nice and tight, and then you block it, it'll relax a lot. Or maybe a lace pattern or some sort of crochet cables, those can react quite differently to blocking too. It's just always a really good rule of thumb to make sure that, like I said, whatever you're planning to do to the finished item, you need to do to the swatch. So this is where yarn substitutions can really come into play. Let's say you're following a pattern that calls for a medium weight acrylic yarn, but you bought yourself some really beautiful medium weight, also known as worsted weight yarn from either a boutique, or you treated yourself online, and it's a superwash merino wool, which is popular in the hand-dyed yarn scene. So chances are, a lot of times if you're getting a hand-dyed yarn, you're getting a superwash merino wool. So like I said, superwash merino wool will grow significantly with blocking. So that's why it's super important that if you are substituting your yarn, the only way to know that that yarn is going to work is if you block it. Let's say with that example, you're making that a sweater that was originally made with acrylic yarn. You're going to use your fancy superwash merino wool. So you decide to make a swatch. You use the same crochet hook size just to see where you're at, and you block it, and you see that your swatch grew significantly. So now you want to make sure you kind of tighten your stitches to try to get that gauge. So we're getting a smaller crochet hook, and we're going to just try it again, and hopefully we get it. And if you get it, great. And if you can't get gauge, even after fiddling with different crochet hook sizes, it may be that that yarn just might not work for that pattern. It's really important to note that if you do use a yarn substitution, and if you have to adjust your crochet hook size significantly, it can really create a different fabric than that of the pattern. So let's say you're getting gauge, but the fabric looks completely different. It's either like really, really tight, or it's just super loose, like super airy and loose, and it doesn't look anything like what the pattern looks like at this point. It's really important that you like that fabric, because otherwise then maybe that yarn just doesn't work. So these examples of gauge are really just scratching the surface. There's so much we could talk about. I could probably talk about gauge all day. It's just that big of a topic, that important of a topic, but I really hope that this kind of helps you along on your crochet journey and helps you enough for tackling your next crochet project. Gauge is really just an unkept secret on ensuring that your finished project, whatever it is that you're going to make, is going to be the right size when you're done, and no surprises. And so that's it for today's video. I really hope it was helpful for you. If it was, be sure to let me know by giving the video a thumbs up. And if you haven't already and would like to, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a new video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!